Hey guys, I wanted to do something a little different. I've talked about doing this in the past, and I've been wanting to do this more often. Whenever there's a grand finals of a series, I wanted to break it down in a unique way. I think everyone tends to break this down either by looking at a specific player, a specific character, or they just look at specific fights that led to the game closing out. But I wanted to kind of teach people a little bit more about tactics and strategy and kind of understand a little bit how these teams created their strategy that got them to this point. And in order to do that, I need to talk a little bit about tactics strategy as well as just behavioral psychology. And you guys might be wondering why behavioral psychology even comes into it, but I'm going to be talking a lot about quotes from things like war generals as well as a lot from The Art of War and Sun Tzu. I probably am going to be quoting a little too much that it might get on your nerves, but that's okay. And so in order to talk a little bit more about that, I have to explain why behavioral psychology comes into this. And behavioral psychology is basically if you do something and you get rewarded, you're subconsciously and consciously more likely to do that thing. If you do something and you're punished, you're subconsciously and consciously more likely to not do that thing. And so the more you do things in your life, the more you're shaped by the rewards and punishments that you have had in your life. Well, the same is true with tactics, to the point that even animals have the same tactics that are shown in things like The Art of War. There's a quote in The Art of War that says, "Let your plans be dark and impenetrable as night, and when you move, fall like a thunderbolt." Have you ever seen like a dog, like kind of an untrained dog, like your friend's dog or something, and he's always like slyly looking at the food from the corner of his eye, and he's slowly moving over, but then like he acts like he's doing something else, and then he grabs like a pizza or something, and just runs off immediately as fast as possible with that pizza and tries to grab as much as possible. Like, he's actually using The Art of War without knowing it. And so much of us use The Art of War without knowing it that I did want to kind of share that while I'm going to be quoting The Art of War, sometimes neither of these teams really understand The Art of War, but it's just been a base of behavioral psychology that's built upon over years of playing this game as well as other games like this. But we'll get a sneak peek because we're going to be looking at people who have strategized and learned these things for years, and also people like Sun Tzu who has been watching war strategy and tactics over the previous 100 years before he wrote the book. So this will give you guys a great idea where you don't need to build up all this behavioral psychology to become these perfect warriors in these games, but instead you can learn a little bit from this game to learn why these teams have done what they've done. So let's get started. I will say there will be spoilers. This is the last game of the grand finals, so the winner of this game is the winner of CCL 2020. Or I guess 2021, because it did kind of move into 2021. But either way, you get the point. This is the winner of CCL 2020. So there are a lot of spoilers that will be happening in this game, and that is okay. So to start off, let's talk a little bit about what Sun Tzu was. So Sun Tzu was a war general, but in particular, he was a war researcher that looked at a lot of wars that have been fought, and in ancient China, there were a lot of wars that were always being fought. He primarily wanted to try to win wars without fighting. It's been repeated in The Art of War numerous times under numerous categories. One of the popular ones is the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Another common quote is, "The greatest victory is that which requires no battle." It's so common in The Art of War. Now, the way that he primarily wants to get that done is he usually wants to get it done with a treaty or with espionage. But in Heroes of the Storm, especially in the competitive environment, we're not always going to be able to see or create a treaty. So instead, we have to use other tactics to win battles without actually fighting. You're going to see Cure doing something that I've praised so often. You see that he leaves a couple minions up here when he sees that Zergling leaves this lane. He's leaving these minions here because he wants to freeze the lane. He's going to be able to pick up these 2 minions worth of soak, but you're going to notice that the Sonya that left earlier is going to miss all of this soak. Freezing the lane is an important strategy for costing the enemy soak and preventing them from getting a lot of that extra experience. In the early portions of the game, a wave of soak is equivalent to a kill. And in fact, at level 1, a wave of soak is equivalent to 2 kills. It evens out at about level 7, depending on if you're on a 2-lane or a 3-lane map, and it doubles at about level 13, where you would need 2 waves of soak to equal a kill. So that being said, Cure effectively already got a kill on the Zergling, even though Zergling's team got a kill on them. What ends up happening is Simplicity actually ends up with higher experience despite being down 1 kill because of that small play that Cure did. So to start off, we're going to be seeing a lot of tiny plays like that, where they are going to be making these very, very simple changes. And one of the things that, this is a quote, and I'm going to butcher this quote completely because I don't remember exactly who said it, but there was a pretty big coach that said something along the lines of like, the best teams are not the ones that make the biggest plays. It's the best teams are the ones that make the ordinary decisions, and they do it with the best consistency, or something of that sort. And basically what he was meaning is the teams that generally win are the teams that practice the best and practice the most often, and they have the most rigorous training. That way, when you actually get on the field, they already know what to do, and they're going to do it perfectly. And that's kind of true with this as well. The early portions of the game in Heroes of the Storm is rather boring. It's rather ordinary. So the teams that generally get ahead in experience are the ones that just do the boring stuff the best. Freezing the lane, double soaking, getting the camps that you need to get, setting up for things, and just basically having your strategies and your tactics practiced enough to where you will be able to win the earlier fights. Now, I need to talk a little bit about the tactics of these teams and their overall strategy for early fights. When you get to this highest level of competitive play, you need to have a plan standardization. What a plan standardization is it's basically an overall plan that your team needs to kind of stick to, and you can adapt with shot calling, but you need an overall plan that your team has practiced and gotten so good at that you won't be making a lot of mistakes when you're going against these very, very powerful teams. You're going to see Weary Day knocking back people, and that's part of Wildheart's early standardized plan. So the early standardized plan for Wildheart is going to be Garrosh stands on a point, flips to Tychus to follow up. Tychus is going to follow up, and if it doesn't work, Lucio is going to reset. And Lucio resets by knocking back the enemies, speeding up his team to get away, and then everyone gets healed back up. And that is going to be the standardized plan for Wildheart in the early portions of the game. The standardized plan for Simplicity in the early portions of the game is going to be portal in, Diablo's going to engage, and then we're going to have a little bit of follow-up. If the follow-up doesn't work, we're going to take the portals back out and see what we can do from there. And that's basically the standardized plans for both of these teams to start. The standardized plans will then switch at level 10, and they will adjust with ultimate abilities. So, for example, standardized post-level 10 plans for Simplicity is going to be Entomb to set up a team fight, get in a good position, Leyline into Apocalypse, and then follow up the stuns on the targets that are going to get stunned by Apocalypse after the Leyline. The standardized post-10 plan for the side of Wildheart is going to be utilize the slows from Chromie and take very slow fights where they will take these very calculated approaches and look for little picks with the Garrosh throws as well as the Tychus burst damage. And so now that you understand both of these teams' standardized plans, you're going to notice that basically every move that they make from this point in the game is going to fit slightly into one of those standardized plans, with very few exceptions, and you can notice those shot-called exceptions will most likely be to punish mistakes that the enemies are making. And so we're going to start seeing a lot of these standardized plans as this game moves forward, but for now, we're going to start looking at, again, creating leads where we can, as well as kind of pushing to punish weaknesses. You're going to notice with a couple of the members going down to deal with that, you see Wildheart approaching in the top lane and pushing aggressively because they know that the enemies cannot fight back when the enemies are not level 10, and they know that the enemies can't fight back when they are missing a person. And this is basically another strategy that is already, again, it's built up by this behavioral psychology, but it also is something that is so common in war. In fact, again, as early as ancient China, we've seen this before. In war, avoid what is strong and strike what is weak. And we're going to see a lot of that in the coming fights that we're going to be seeing between these two teams. And both of these teams are going to be abusing this strategy. When the enemy is stronger, they generally avoid the fight and they take the losses where they come. And when they do see any form of weakness, they try to punish that immediately by getting as much value as possible. And we're going to be seeing that more and more as this game goes on. With that being said, I've talked a lot about strategy and tactics, so I want to kind of explain a little bit of what those terms mean, since we will have a little bit of downtime in between these fights as we're approaching closer to the mid and late game. So basically, we've all heard what macro and micro is. When you're working individually to improve yourself as a player, you've got macro, which is the overall map. It's things that you can do on the map. It's overall strategy that you can do throughout the game. And here we go. We see the basic ley line into APOC. We see the slowing sands. Both of these teams are going with their basic standardized plan that they've already created for their team comps. And it's working for these teams, but it's going to end up punishing both teams a little bit. Tychus has already been lost on one side. We also see Garrosh being lost. We almost lost Zergling, and we almost lost Weary Day as well. And on the opposite side, we almost lost Lutano, Legacy, as well as Hosty. So at this stage, Simplicity's playing their standardized plan a little bit better, and they are also going to strike what's weak. The enemy are down their tanks, so they're going to get as much value as possible. I want to continue the point that I was making on tactics and strategy, as we can still watch Simplicity and Wildheart duke it out in the background. So with micro and macro is generally individual mechanics of how you're landing your abilities, as well as how everything is playing out with you dodging things, landing abilities, and being able to stutter step. That is micro, and that's also often called mechanics. Macro is the overall map. Are you able to double soak on your own to give your team a lead? Are you able to grab a wave, grab a camp, and then come back and grab a wave without losing any soak for your team? What can you do to give yourself an advantage without necessarily fighting the enemies? That is macro. Well, the same thing is kind of true with tactics and strategy. Strategy is the overall plan going into the map. It's the overall plan for war, where tactics is generally how your team executes that on a small scale, how your little combos work out, and how everything plans out in that way. And that's kind of the approach that you want to be looking at when you're designing what your team should do. Don't just create strategy, create tactics as well. And don't just create tactics, create strategy as well. You need both perfect tactics and strategy to be able to beat any team. Because you can see how maybe a good plan falls apart when it's not practiced enough. That being said, what we noticed was a lot of turret usage. And again, I mean, that comes back down to the idea of try to win without fighting if you can, because it makes it a lot easier when you do have to fight. You already have all these advantages. And again, they're striking when weak. They took out 2 targets, and now they're going to get as much siege damage off as possible. I mean, both of these teams are basically using the same form of strategy and tactics that we've seen in the Art of War, and honestly, that we've seen from our own behavior, as well as our own animals' behavior. I mean, I don't mean to bring back, Terry the thieving terrier. I don't know. I was going to go with, like, Tiny Terry, and then, I don't know, it doesn't really matter. But that's the thing, is tactics and strategy is not just a thing of war, but it's a thing of life. And it certainly is used in these areas. But that being said, let's move on a little bit. I do want to talk a little bit about stealing camps, because it's not just about stealing the camp itself. There's this whole idea about war of attrition. War of attrition was basically when wars used to be fought in much longer times. You used to have to set up a fort, and at that fort you would be fighting there for months at a time, where you'd come up with plans and try to hold your ground in different areas. And a war of attrition was a way to kind of win without ever needing to fight anyone or really kill anyone. You would take down transports, you would destroy farms, and they would run out of food and basically surrender without you ever needing to kill anyone at that fort. stealing enemy camps is something that you're going to see both of these teams put a lot of priority on because it's a great way to kind of fight that war of attrition. You steal experience that the team needs for a talent tier. You steal an item that they might need to win a particular objective. And it's even worth it if you've ever seen a team that will win their fort, they'll win their turret and they'll go over and they'll use the turret to win another turret. You're like, hey, they wasted their turret just to grab our turret. What they're actually doing is just stealing your turret and essentially deleting it off the map by using their turret to steal your turret, which means not only it may feel like it was an even trade, but it really isn't. They're actually getting a huge advantage because they're taking experience twice. They're getting the turrets twice and effectively only keeping one of them, but they're also removing your turret from the game. So fighting a war of attrition is something that happens a lot in these fights, in these particular games where there's not a lot of fights. This is the two highest level teams in CCL duking it out, and it almost feels like there's barely any fights going on. There are a couple big fights that are happening. Once again, standardized plan. We've got the ley line into APOC. They're able to quickly take out Lutana without much of an issue because they have a standardized plan that they've practiced this tactics of over and over. And that is why these games end up being rather predictable these days, is because the team that plans the most ends up having a much easier time because they've practiced these over and over. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that Wildheart hasn't practiced these strategies a lot. But sometimes it just comes down to that. There was a quote from a war general that said something like, the more sweat you put into a plan, the less blood results from it. And it's basically that. These teams are going in with a standardized plan that they've practiced so often that they almost don't need very long fights to close out and win these objectives. And even though they lost some of the earlier fights, their post-level 10 standardized plan was just so much more clean and executed so much better than Wildheart's plan that from this point in the game, I mean, it almost seems like Wildheart can't kill anyone because it just keeps going in the same pattern over and over and over. And so now that you guys understand what basic tactics are, what strategies are, and what you should be focusing on when you are creating these strategies and tactics for your team, you'll kind of understand a little bit more about how to win more games, and you'll understand a little bit more about how the enemy teams are beating your teams. If you notice that the enemy team is winning in team fights, you might want to watch the replay and go, okay, well, what was their standardized plan? And was it better than ours, or did we just execute ours more poorly? Because sometimes all it is execution. You have a better plan, but you executed it poorly, and sometimes you honestly did just come up with a worse plan. And I've been there. I've actually had this joke. I thought for the longest time I was just telling it to the wrong audience, and it was this chemistry joke that I would always tell to like friends and they would never laugh. Then I'd tell it to family members and they would never laugh. I told it to this group that I was marketing with and they would never laugh. And then finally I told this joke to a bunch of chemistry majors and I was like, this is it. I'm finally gonna know that my joke was actually funny and I was just telling it to the wrong audiences. And well, the chemistry majors didn't laugh either. So ultimately it was just a bad joke. And sometimes you need to think internally a little bit where you just go, maybe it was my strategy that was bad and it wasn't the execution. So be critical about everything, but be willing to practice things enough to where you learn if the strategy is actually a bad strategy, or even those tactics are bad tactics. Now that the early game's done, it's basically just, again, execution. It's the original plans that they had, it's execution, and it's adaptation to those plans. It's not that complicated. I think sometimes people like to pause and look at every little detail of, oh, well, they did this because of this, they did this because of this. It's like, there's only so much time to talk about things when you're in comms that it's actually not that complicated. Sometimes it's just about executing the plan that you've practiced and adapting in comms where, oh, hey, we don't have APOC for this next ley line, so let's be ready to follow up with a Rain of Vengeance and potentially like a polymorph. Or in the side of Wildheart, you know, we were going to be using the slowing sands in this area to force them into a bad position, but they're actually kind of overcommitting into this. Let's adjust and move it just into an open area, so we force them into a clustered area to avoid it. Like, there's a ton of ways that you can adapt, and that comes down to just practice. The more you execute a plan, the more you can practice around it. So let's watch the last 3 minutes of this particular game, and we'll kind of go from there. So Simplicity has that standardized plan that they've been going with this entire time, and we also have Wildheart. That standardized plan is not working. Oftentimes, I mean, we have, what is it, Einstein's definition of insanity, which technically I don't even think Einstein ever actually said it, but if you do the same thing and you expect a different result, you're insane, basically. Or Einstein's definition of insanity is basically something like that, which, again, I don't even know if Einstein ever said that, but that's who it's usually thrown to. So if Wildheart has been losing most of these post-level 10 fights, now they're level 20s, they need to determine a way to win these fights, and they need to adjust their strategy by just a little bit. The targets that they've been going for are primarily backline targets, and they keep trying to use this burst damage from Tychus, but it keeps getting... The throws are getting portaled away with the Garrosh, and the burst damage is being dealt with by the Medivh. The Medivh is really ruining their plan completely. So they need to approach these fights much slower and really try to abuse the W damage from Sonya, as well as the slows and everything. Unfortunately, portaled in, and they immediately were able to take out the Chromie. They were immediately able to set up for the fight that they wanted. They're able to shield against the throw once again, and they're able to take just about whatever they want. They had a plan that was very strong, and they are just abusing their advantages. Something that I kind of wish more teams that are learning from these games would do is abuse a lead. If you do start winning, destroy structures. It's something that both of these teams have done a lot during this game. We've seen Tychus pop his ult and destroy some structures down bottom. We've seen both of these teams, they capitalize on kills. I say this thing when I'm coaching teams. I often say, if you kill one person, try to steal a camp. You kill 2 people, destroy a turret. If you kill 3 people, destroy a fort. If you kill 4 people, destroy a keep. If you kill 5 people, end the game. Now, naturally, you can't always do that. You kill 5 people early on, you don't actually lead to a kill or end the game. But basically, just understand that whenever you do get kills, try to get something with those kills. In this case, they are staying alive through just about anything. Legacy is doing an incredible job keeping his team topped off. Hosty's doing an incredible job making sure this team doesn't die to burst, and also keeping the enemies managed as their team goes and closes out this game. And I mean, it's incredible how Simplicity went from being the 7th team in the CCL to going to being the top team. And ultimately, I think it's a mix of a few things. I think that they changed their draft up a bit on the players that they had, and I think that with new brains coming into the mix, being able to kind of look at these new strategies, and also from what I heard, and this could be wrong, Simplicity could come out and correct me, but from what I heard from one of the members of their team, they were able to actually practice a lot more with their new roster that they couldn't practice with their old roster. Having more time to practice really allowed them to set themselves apart, practice these tactics that they had, to the point that they were able to clean up pretty much every fight post level 10. And with just slight strategy changes, they were able to keep themselves in the game despite struggling in the early portions of the game. And that's kind of how Simplicity's played in a lot of these games. They have a strategy that keeps them in the game until the late game, and pure tactics is what gets them through the late portions. And that's it. That is how Simplicity has gone from being 7th place in CCL to completely winning CCL, purely off of those plans. And you guys can learn from these as well. There are a ton of books out there from war generals. I always recommend The Art of War. You can usually pick it up for a couple bucks. It's just such an old book that's been reprinted a million times. So I always recommend checking that book out. It's just filled with a bunch of quotes and proverbs that have been used in war. And it's a book that almost every army general has read at some point. So I highly recommend checking that out. If you guys want to learn more about behavioral psychology, I recommend learning more from the founder himself. BF Skinner, he's long dead, of course, but his work kind of explains a little bit more about how basically everything that we do in our days is defined by sets of reinforcement that have been created between rewards and punishments for everything. I mean, down to how you brush your teeth. You brush your teeth one way and it starts hurting a little bit, so you adjust it slightly, and down to how you brush your teeth, eat your food, how you talk to people is all built upon your behavior. That's all built upon all of these reinforcements that have been created. So if you guys want to learn more about behavioral psychology, definitely check out some work from BF Skinner. Check out The Art of War, and you guys can learn a lot more about this. But if you guys can learn the basics of tactics and strategy, you can pretty much predict every fight going on post level 10 in this game from teams that are as practiced as these teams. And it's kind of interesting to be able to watch and be able to call this out while watching these games. So I hope that this gave you guys another appreciation for watching esports, specifically Masters Clash and CCL, because now you have a new idea of how they are going to be approaching each of their fights. Now, I didn't talk to either of these teams, so as far as their standardized plans, I watched the game first to learn what they were going for each time, and I rewound and went back. You might not know the standardized plan of a team that you're about to watch play, and that's kind of something that they don't want you to know, because they don't want the enemy team to know. You can take guesses. If you see Leyline and APOC, you pretty much know what they're going to go for. Diablo and Medivh, you're going to know what they're going to go for. But you might not know everything about their standardized plans. So it is something fun to watch and kind of guess as you're playing the game to determine what each team is trying to accomplish with their strategy. With all of that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this more in-depth video, let me know, and I can do more breakdowns kind of like that. I promise you guys I won't do as many quotes as I did during this video, but usually I'll have one quote that I like to build a video based off of. If you'd like to learn more about psychology videos, let me know down in the comments below, and I appreciate you guys hanging in there throughout CCL and throughout the ups and downs of this game and COVID in general. COVID's been kind of weird for me, as I'd imagine it's been weird for you guys, so thank you guys so much for sticking with it, and I'll see you guys in my next video.